She was signing her Nobel Prize acceptance speech when she saw him in the audience. The man who divorced her when she became paralyzed, now watching her accept the world's highest honor for the technology that saved his life. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. This story begins 5 years earlier, on a night when Elena Chen lost everything, and had no idea she was about to gain so much more. What would you do if the person who promised to love you forever walked away at your lowest point? This is what happened to Elena, and what she did next changed not just her life, but the lives of millions. If you've ever been underestimated, abandoned, or told you weren't enough, hit subscribe now. You'll want to see where this goes. It was their 5th wedding anniversary. Elena sat in the passenger seat, one hand resting on her stomach where a 10-week-old secret was growing. In her purse, wrapped in silver paper, were baby shoes the size of her thumb. Tonight, at their favorite restaurant, she would tell Marcus they were going to be parents. But Marcus wasn't paying attention to the road. His phone kept buzzing with work emails, the screen glowing blue in the darkness. Elena asked him to put it down. "Just for tonight," she said. "Just for their anniversary." He nodded, but his eyes drifted back to the screen. Just one more message, he told himself. One more second. That second cost everything. Elena saw the headlights first. She screamed his name as the other car swerved into their lane. Marcus looked up too late. The impact sounded like the end of the world. Metal screaming, glass exploding, and Elena's last conscious thought was a desperate prayer for the baby she hadn't yet told him about. Then darkness. 3 days later, Elena woke to the sharp smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic beep of heart monitors. Her mouth was dry, her body felt distant and strange, like it belonged to someone else. The first words out of her cracked lips were asking if Marcus was okay. A nurse with tired eyes and purple scrubs told her that Marcus was fine. Not a scratch. He had stepped out for some air about 4 hours ago. Elena turned her head toward the empty chair beside her bed. 4 hours. She tried to wiggle her toes, a movement she'd done a million times without thinking. The kind of thing you do absently while watching TV or waiting in line. But her toes didn't respond. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else's body, distant and disconnected. The first doctor came at noon with a clipboard and clinical detachment. He used words like permanent and spinal cord damage and paralysis from the waist down. Elena understood. She was a neurosurgeon herself. She knew what permanent meant in medical terms, knew the statistics, the research, the grim reality. She nodded, asked rational questions about treatment protocols and physical therapy options, and didn't cry. The second doctor came that evening. A woman with graying hair who sat close and held Elena's hand with both of hers. She spoke softly, and the gentleness in her voice was somehow worse than the clinical detachment of the first doctor. Elena had been pregnant. 10 weeks. Past tense. The sound that came from Elena's throat wasn't crying. It was something deeper, more primal. The howl of a mother losing a child she would never meet, a future vanishing before it began. And through it all, Marcus stood at the window with his back to her, shoulders rigid, staring at the parking lot lights below. Elena begged him to just hold her. To sit beside her bed and be there with her in this impossible darkness. Marcus's voice, when he finally spoke, was hollow and distant. He said he couldn't. Just 2 words. I can't. Those 2 words were the beginning of the end, though Elena didn't know it yet. The next 8 months were a slow death. Not of Elena, but of her marriage. It died in the guest room where Marcus started sleeping, claiming his work schedule was too erratic to share a bed. It died in his late nights at the office that stretched from occasional to constant, from 3 nights a week to 6. It died at 3 in the morning when Elena fell trying to reach the bathroom alone and lay on cold tile for 20 minutes, too proud to wake the husband who had made it clear she was a burden. Elena threw herself into physical therapy with desperate intensity. She pushed until her muscles screamed, until sweat soaked through her clothes, until she vomited from pain in the gym bathroom. She learned to walk short distances with a walker, legs shaking with effort, every step a small war. She wasn't doing it for herself. She was doing it because she thought if she could just be more like the woman Marcus married, if she could just walk again, he would remember why he loved her. But the harder Elena tried, the further Marcus pulled away. He started leaving takeout containers on the kitchen counter just out of reach from her wheelchair. The first time, he apologized profusely, embarrassed and sorry. The second time, he said he forgot. By the sixth time, Elena realized it wasn't an accident. It was a message. On their anniversary, 8 months after the crash, Elena spent 3 hours preparing Marcus's favorite meal. Beef Wellington. The kitchen was hot, the oven making the small space feel like a sauna. Her back ached from standing with her walker, and sweat dripped down her face as she carefully pulled the roasting pan from the oven with shaking hands. This dinner would remind him, she thought. This would bring him back to who they used to be. She heard the front door open. Then 2 sets of footsteps. Her heart sank. Marcus walked into the kitchen with a woman in an expensive charcoal suit carrying a leather briefcase. Elena's legs gave out. Just stopped working. The roasting pan slipped from her hands and crashed to the floor, hours of work exploding across the tile in a mess of gravy and shattered golden pastry. Marcus looked at his wife on the floor, covered in the anniversary dinner she'd worked so hard to make, and sighed like she'd inconvenienced him. Like this was just another example of the problem. The woman was his lawyer. The briefcase held divorce papers. Marcus told Elena she was a deadweight. He said he didn't sign up for this, that he needed a partner who could walk, who could dance, who could live a normal life. This, he said, gesturing at her and the wheelchair folded in the corner and the ruined food spreading across the floor, this isn't living. 8 months of swallowed pain crystallized into clarity. Elena looked up at him from the floor and asked if he remembered his proposal. It was in a hospital hallway at 3 in the morning, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of coffee and exhaustion in the air. She had just spent 12 hours removing a tumor from his mother's brain. Her hands hadn't shaken once during that surgery, holding a woman's life in her fingers and choosing to save it. Marcus had knelt right there on the linoleum floor and told her he'd never met anyone with hands that could hold life and death and choose life every time. That's why he wanted to marry her, he said. Because of who she was, because of those steady hands and that brilliant mind. But that was before the accident. Before disability made her worthless in his eyes. Then Elena told him about the baby. The baby she'd been carrying the night of the accident. The baby she'd been planning to announce at their anniversary dinner. The baby that died because Marcus couldn't put his phone down for 5 minutes. The color drained from Marcus's face. In 8 months, he'd never asked if there had been other casualties from the crash he caused. He'd been too consumed with his own guilt and shame to see anyone's pain but his own. Elena signed the papers with steady hands that didn't shake. Then she twisted off her wedding ring, swollen fingers making it difficult, and held it out to him. She told Marcus he was right. She wasn't the woman he married anymore. That woman would have begged him to stay, would have believed love could survive anything. But she died in the accident too, along with their baby and their marriage. After Marcus left, Elena sat on the kitchen floor until darkness filled the apartment and the ruined food congealed into cold lumps. Then she picked up her phone and called her brother David. When David arrived at 2 in the morning, he didn't say anything. He just walked through the apartment Marcus had abandoned, stepped over the ruined dinner, and sat down on the floor beside his sister without a word. He let her cry. Really cry. For the first time since the accident, Elena let herself completely fall apart. She cried for the baby she would never hold. For the husband who couldn't love her broken. For every moment she'd suffered alone while trying to be strong enough to keep a man who didn't want to be kept. For the future she'd imagined that would never exist. When the tears finally stopped, David told her it was time to stop hiding. Because here's what Marcus never knew about Elena. She came from money. Serious money. Her father had built a tech empire before he died when Elena was 16, and she had inherited not just his wealth but his brilliant, relentless mind. She'd hidden this deliberately, carefully, because her first fiancé had only wanted her for her family's fortune. When Marcus proposed in that hospital hallway, she thought she'd finally found someone who loved her for herself, not her bank account. But there was something else Marcus didn't know. During those 8 months while he thought Elena was just going to physical therapy and wasting away in their apartment, she'd been working. Under the pseudonym Dr. L. Chen, she'd been publishing groundbreaking research on neural regeneration. 17 papers in 8 months, collaborating with scientists in Singapore and Berlin, working late into the night after Marcus went to sleep in his separate room. She'd been developing Neuralink, a revolutionary neural implant that could create artificial pathways around damaged spinal tissue, using carefully calibrated bioelectric signals to reconnect brain commands to paralyzed limbs. Elena had been building the future while Marcus was running from the past. 2 weeks later, Elena held a press conference. She sat at a podium in a custom wheelchair, sleek black carbon fiber with blue accents that her brother had insisted on. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone, and camera flashes made the room feel too bright. Behind her, her company's logo gleamed on a massive screen. She introduced herself as Dr. Elena Chen, and some reporters recognized the name Dr. L. Chen from 17 groundbreaking papers on neural regeneration that had been making waves in the scientific community. Then she told them what they didn't know. She was paralyzed from the waist down. She'd lost her ability to walk 8 months and 14 days ago in a car accident. She'd also lost her baby in that accident. And her husband had divorced her, calling her a deadweight, because he couldn't handle being married to someone disabled. The room erupted with voices and questions shouted over each other. But Elena raised one hand and somehow, silence fell like snow. She announced Neuralink. A revolutionary implant that could restore motor function by rerouting neural signals around spinal damage through a network of microscopic electrodes. Behind her, screens showed colorful brain scans, videos of successful animal trials, preliminary human results showing 73% of participants regaining some degree of motor control. Some could walk again. Some regained hand function. Some simply got back the independence they thought was lost forever. A reporter in the front row raised her hand and asked if Elena would undergo the procedure herself. Elena smiled for the first time in months, and it was genuine. Eventually, she said. But right now, there were thousands of people who had been waiting longer than her. People who'd been told their lives were over, who'd been abandoned by partners and employers and a society that didn't value them anymore. Those people would go first. Because this wasn't about proving she could walk again. It was about proving that disability wasn't a death sentence, wasn't a character flaw, wasn't a tragedy to be pitied. It was simply part of the human experience. And if she could go back, if she could choose between walking and becoming who she'd become, learning what she'd learned, she would choose the wheelchair. Because it forced her to find strength she didn't know she had. She didn't mention that this was partially a lie, that some mornings she still woke up reaching for the baby that never was, that she would give anything to go back to that car and make Marcus put the phone down. But those truths were hers to keep. Marcus saw the press conference on the television in his office during an investor meeting. Someone had mentioned the disabled doctor with revolutionary neural technology, excited about the investment potential and stock implications. An investor pulled up the live stream on the conference room screen, and Marcus sat frozen in his leather chair as his ex-wife's face filled the display. She looked different. Thinner, yes, but stronger somehow. There was steel in her eyes, a confidence that commanded immediate respect. Her voice was steady and clear. When she mentioned being abandoned by her husband, several people in the room glanced sideways at Marcus. They knew. Of course they knew. Office gossip travels faster than elevators. That night, Marcus went home to his new apartment and watched the video again on his laptop in the dark. He heard Elena mention the baby for the first time, and the guilt that had been sitting in his chest for 8 months turned into something darker, heavier, like wet concrete hardening around his heart. She'd never told him about the pregnancy. But he knew why. Every time she tried to talk to him after the accident, every time she'd reached out, he'd walked away. Made excuses. Avoided her eyes. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. She'd seen the announcement. She told him she was ashamed of him, that he'd abandoned a brilliant, beautiful woman when she needed him most, that she didn't want to hear his excuses or explanations. Marcus sat in the dark and looked at old photos on his phone. Their wedding day, with Elena radiant in her dress and him looking at her like she was the only person in the world. The proposal in the hospital hallway, with her in scrubs, exhausted but smiling, and him on his knees on that ugly linoleum floor. When had he stopped looking at her that way? When had her disability become bigger than her humanity? The answer was immediately. The moment he realized he'd caused the accident, the moment he understood his carelessness had destroyed her life, he'd started running from his own guilt. Not because Elena had changed, but because he couldn't face what he'd done. Meanwhile, Elena was building an empire. Chen Biotech stock soared, doubling in value within weeks. She became the face of disability advocacy and cutting-edge medical research. Magazine covers. Speaking engagements at conferences. Award ceremonies where she rolled onto stages in that sleek wheelchair and spoke with authority about redefining human potential. She also met someone. James Park had been her physical therapist for 3 months before Elena realized she looked forward to their sessions. Not because of the exercises, which still hurt and frustrated her when her body wouldn't cooperate. But because James never pitied her. The first time they met, 2 weeks after the divorce, Elena had been in a dark place. She'd told him flatly that she didn't see the point in physical therapy. She wasn't going to walk again, so why torture herself? James had looked at her thoughtfully and said she was right. She might not walk again. His honesty had surprised her. But he'd continued, explaining that this wasn't about walking. It was about making her life easier. Stronger core meant better balance. Better balance meant easier transfers. Easier transfers meant independence. Independence meant freedom. Over months of sessions, Elena learned James was a widower. His wife had died of cancer 3 years ago, and he understood loss in ways that didn't require explanation. His younger sister Michelle was deaf, and he'd grown up watching people treat her like she was broken, talking to him instead of her, assuming she couldn't understand. Michelle was now an award-winning photographer living in Tokyo, dating a man who'd learned sign language before their first date, living proof that other people's limitations aren't your problem. James didn't pity Elena. He challenged her, supported her, saw her as a complete person. Their first date was coffee at a small cafe near the hospital. James greeted the deaf barista in sign language, which made Elena smile. They talked for 3 hours about favorite books and terrible reality TV and shared love of awful puns. For the first time in a year, Elena really laughed. Not a polite chuckle but a genuine, surprised laugh that came from somewhere she thought had died. James smiled like he'd just witnessed something precious and rare. But James wasn't perfect. Their third date, he admitted he'd almost cancelled their first one. Not because he wasn't interested, but because he was terrified. He'd watched his wife die slowly, watched her body betray her piece by piece, and he wasn't sure he could handle loving someone whose body might fail them again. It was honest and raw and made Elena respect him more, not less. Because he chose to try anyway. Chose her anyway. 6 months after the press conference, Marcus's world started crumbling. His pharmaceutical company had bet everything on a competitor's neural technology to save their failing neurology division. Neuralink had just made that technology completely obsolete. The company was hemorrhaging money and laying off employees in waves. Then Marcus started having symptoms. Numbness in his hands that spread to his forearms. Dropped coffee cups. Stumbling on flat ground. When he finally saw a neurologist, the diagnosis was devastating. A rare degenerative neural disease, aggressive and fast-moving. Without treatment, maybe 2 years before he lost most motor function. Wheelchair-bound within 18 months. The only technology showing real promise in reversing neural degeneration was Neuralink. The same technology his ex-wife had developed while he was abandoning her. The woman he'd called a deadweight. Marcus stared at the clinical trial application on his computer screen. He would have to submit his complete medical history, personal information, and hope to be selected from thousands of desperate applicants. He would have to face Elena and ask for help from the woman he'd left on a kitchen floor covered in ruined anniversary dinner. His pride screamed at him to find another option, any other option. His survival instinct was louder. He submitted the application and waited. Elena saw his name on the list of trial applicants and her hands froze on her keyboard. She read his medical file, saw the diagnosis, understood exactly what he was facing and how terrified he must be. For a long moment, she sat in her office staring at his information while memories flooded back like a dam breaking. The proposal. The wedding. Their first apartment. The accident. The divorce. All of it. James found her there an hour later, still staring at the screen, and asked quietly if she was okay. Elena told him about Marcus's application. James sat down across from her and asked what she wanted to do. Elena didn't know. Part of her wanted to reject the application outright, to let Marcus experience what it felt like to be abandoned when you're vulnerable and scared and desperately need help. Part of her remembered the vows she'd taken, the man she'd loved, the person she used to be who believed in choosing life every single time. James reminded her this wasn't about Marcus. It was about who Elena was, who she wanted to be. She didn't have to forgive Marcus to help him. The ability to separate personal pain from professional duty was what made her an exceptional doctor. Elena made her decision. She would help Marcus, but on her terms. When Marcus arrived at her office in Chen Biotech's gleaming headquarters, he barely recognized the woman sitting behind the massive glass desk. This wasn't the Elena who'd begged him to hold her in that hospital room, small and broken and desperate. This was Dr. Elena Chen, CEO, revolutionary scientist, woman who turned devastation into determination and built an empire from ashes. Elena reviewed his application with clinical detachment. Neuralink could potentially help his condition. But the trial had a long waiting list of people who'd been suffering for years, people who deserved this chance. Simply submitting an application didn't guarantee acceptance. Marcus asked what he could do. Elena told him exactly what she required. If he wanted access to her life's work, he needed to prove he understood what he'd thrown away. 3 months volunteering at a disability advocacy center. Spend actual time with people living with disabilities. See them as human beings instead of tragedies or burdens or inconveniences. Marcus wanted to argue, to say it was manipulative and cruel, but he looked at Elena's calm, steady gaze and knew he had no ground to stand on. He'd been manipulative and cruel. This was mercy. At first, Marcus was resentful, going through the motions, checking boxes to earn his spot in the trial. But slowly, something shifted. He met an 8-year-old girl named Sophie who used a wheelchair and absolutely destroyed him at basketball, laughing at his terrible shots and trash-talking with the confidence of someone who'd never been told she couldn't do something. Her mother watched from the sideline and told Marcus that Sophie didn't remember life before the wheelchair. To her, this was just life. She wasn't brave or inspiring. She was just a kid who happened to use wheels instead of legs. The problem, her mother said firmly, was with people who couldn't see past the chair. He met a man named David who'd been paralyzed for 20 years in a construction accident and now ran a successful architectural firm specializing in accessible design. David had a wife who adored him, 3 kids who climbed all over his wheelchair like it was playground equipment, and a life so full it made Marcus's existence feel empty by comparison. He met a woman named Jennifer with cerebral palsy who was finishing her PhD in astrophysics. When Marcus instinctively started to help her with a door, she stopped him with a sharp look and explained in clear, precise words why his pity was insulting. She didn't need saving. She needed people to stop assuming she was helpless. That conversation haunted Marcus for days because he realized he'd looked at Elena the exact same way. Seen her disability and assumed she needed saving, when really she just needed him to see her. In month 4, Marcus requested another meeting with Elena. Not to ask about the trial. To tell her he finally understood. He'd thought he was the victim of the accident, of the situation, of cruel fate. He'd been so deep in his own guilt and self-pity that he'd made her trauma entirely about him. He'd looked at her disability and seen his own failure instead of seeing her. The brilliant, resilient, extraordinary person she'd always been. Elena listened quietly across her desk. When he finished, she said she appreciated hearing it, but it didn't fix what he'd broken. It didn't give her back the 8 months she'd spent trying to be small enough to keep him. It didn't bring back their baby. Marcus agreed. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't trying to win her back. He just needed her to know that he finally saw it. Saw what he'd done. Saw who she really was. Elena accepted him into the trial. Not because of his apology, but because denying treatment based on personal history would make her exactly like him. And she'd spent 8 months becoming someone better. The surgery was complex, requiring Elena's entire surgical team and 8 hours in the operating room. Elena oversaw it personally, hands as steady as they'd been when she'd saved his mother's life all those years ago. In the recovery room, Marcus watched through medication haze as she checked on him with the same professional care she showed every patient. No special treatment. No lingering resentment. Just a doctor doing her job with excellence. He realized, far too late, that he'd never actually known his wife. He'd loved an image of her, an idea of what he wanted her to be. But he'd never truly seen her the way James did, the way her brother did, the way her patients and colleagues did. He'd loved her conditionally, and when the conditions changed, his love had evaporated like it had never really existed at all. 6 months after the procedure, Marcus's treatment was working. His symptoms had stabilized, even improved slightly. He had his life back, his future restored, because of the woman he'd thrown away like trash. He heard through mutual acquaintances that Elena was getting married. To James, her physical therapist turned partner. Marcus wanted to feel entitled to jealousy, wanted to believe he had some claim to bitterness. But he couldn't. James had done what Marcus couldn't. He'd seen Elena at her most vulnerable and chosen to stay. Chosen to love her not despite her disability but as a complete person who happened to use a wheelchair. On the day of Elena's wedding, Marcus sent a gift. An anonymous donation to Chin Biotech's research fund, enough to fund 3 full scholarships for disabled students pursuing medical degrees. The attached note simply said, "Thank you for showing me what strength looks like. I'm sorry I couldn't see it when it mattered." He didn't attend the wedding. That chapter of her life, the chapter that had included him, was closed and locked. Some doors, once shut, should stay that way. Elena read the note on her wedding day, sitting in her childhood bedroom in her family's house while her mother's best friend helped with her dress. She felt nothing when she saw his name. Not anger, not sadness, not even the satisfaction of revenge. Just a quiet sense of closure, like finishing a book that had been painful to read but necessary to complete. She had spent so long trying to be enough for Marcus, trying to earn his love, trying to prove her worth. But she'd always been enough. He had just been too small, too scared, too consumed by his own limitations to see it. The wedding was beautiful. Elena walked part of the aisle with her walker, James beside her offering his arm for balance but not support, then transitioned to her wheelchair for the final approach to the altar. Some guests cried at what they called the symbolism. But to Elena and James, it wasn't symbolic. It was just her life, just how her body worked, and she wasn't ashamed of any part of it anymore. 5 years later, Elena stood at a podium in Stockholm's concert hall, accepting the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Her acceptance speech wasn't about Neuralink's technical specifications or her research methodology. It was about redefining what disability means, about recognizing that limitations are often in our perspectives rather than in people's bodies. She talked about her journey from that hospital bed to this stage. About being abandoned and finding herself. About loss and resilience and the choice we all have in how we respond to life's cruelties. She dedicated the award to everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, that their lives were tragedies to be pitied, that they were deadweight holding others back. In a small apartment across the city, Marcus watched the live stream on his laptop. He'd remarried a kind woman named Sarah who knew his whole history and loved him anyway, who taught him what real partnership looked like. He was doing advocacy work now with disability rights organizations, trying to make up for the person he'd been, trying to be better than the man who'd left his wife on that kitchen floor. Elena's final words struck him like a physical blow. She said that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for becoming who you were always meant to be. That trauma doesn't define you, but how you respond to it does. That she wouldn't change what happened to her, because it led her here, to this moment, to this life she'd built from the ashes of the one that burned down. After the ceremony, Elena went home to James and their 3-year-old daughter Hope, conceived through IVF and absolutely perfect in every way. Hope had her mother's brilliant mind and her father's patient kindness. When Hope asked why Mama sometimes used a wheelchair and sometimes used her walker, Elena knelt down to her level and explained that her body worked differently than some people's, and that was completely okay. Different wasn't less. Different wasn't wrong. Different was just different. That evening, they went to the park near their house, the one with the accessible playground that Elena had helped design and fund. Hope asked if she could ride on Elena's lap in the wheelchair, and Elena said yes, always yes. They rolled down the gentle hill together, Hope shrieking with laughter, Elena's hair flying in the wind, both of them absolutely free in a way that had nothing to do with how their bodies moved and everything to do with how their hearts felt. Marcus had called her a deadweight and thought her life was over. He'd had no idea he was witnessing her transformation into something far greater than he could ever imagine. Elena Chen didn't need to walk to stand tall. She didn't need Marcus Sterling to know her worth. She had everything she'd built with her own brilliant mind, her own unbreakable spirit, her own steady hands that still chose life every single time. And in the end, that's the greatest victory of all. Not destruction, but transformation. Not bitterness, but becoming. Not proving him wrong about who she was, but proving to herself that she was always right about who she could be. The woman he left behind didn't stay behind. She rose. She soared. She changed the world. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about strength and resilience and what it means to be enough, I need you to do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel because we tell stories about people who refuse to disappear, who turn their pain into purpose, who prove that your worth is never determined by someone else's limitations. Second, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear that they are enough, exactly as they are, right now, no changes required. And third, drop a comment and tell me about a time you were underestimated. I read every single one, and your story matters. Next week, I'm bringing you the story of a woman who was told she was too old and too inexperienced to start a business. She's now worth $50 million. And the person who told her she'd never succeed? They just applied to work at her company. Until then, remember this truth. You are not what happened to you. You are not what people say about you. You are not defined by your limitations or your losses or the people who were too small to see your value. You are what you choose to become. And that choice, that power to decide who you'll be in the face of life's cruelties, has always been yours. It was always yours.